Good morning. It's great to see you, and thank you for coming out. I was glad as I was driving south from Palmer Lake, where we just moved. I thought we might not get out of the town. It was so bad, and then it got nicer and nicer as we came south. So glad it was sunny and the roads are dry down here. But thank you for coming, and thank you to Chuck. I think it's a neat vision, this with all your mind thing. It's just, I think, a tremendously holistic biblical vision to say we don't just love God with what we feel, with our worship, but we include our minds, that they're from God, and we are meant to interact with the world deeply and significantly. And so that vision, it's fun to be a part of that. So that's what we're going to do today. It's going to be mental work. And I will say at the beginning that this exploration of how the story of the Bible works is, I think, something that many people might take for granted. It's the kind of thing like, well, I've heard that, or I've grown up with the Bible, or been around the Bible. But I find that for myself, the story of the Bible that I grew up with, and I grew up in going to Christian schools in Denver, in church all the time. My dad was an elder. We were at church. I was in Christian school. Catechism. Back in those days, on Wednesday afternoons, after going to Christian school all day, we had to go back to church and do catechism on Wednesday afternoons. So I was Bible saturated. But later, I discovered that what I had been told, or kind of was implied to me, was the story of the Bible. I found that actually the story of the Bible was much deeper and richer and better than what I'd been told. And I think that's what can happen for people. Sometimes we're just not told the whole story. So today, hopefully, we're going to explore what the whole story of the Bible is. Now, we're going to do that in two parts, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But first, I just wanted to say to you, these are around, and you don't have to use those, but some people like to have an outline of where we're going to go, and some people like to take notes. So if you're that kind of person, these are available, and there'll be another one for this afternoon session, and then we'll dive in. And then finally, one final thing. About 3 weeks ago, I started getting a cough, and I thought, oh, this glorious event is still 3 weeks away, so it will certainly be gone. But it hasn't gone away entirely. So I am loaded up here. I have drugs. I have liquids. I have prayers happening. So I'm figuring with all of that, there's a chance we might get through this together. But if I have to cough a little bit, I'm asking for your grace and understanding up front, because I just have not been able to shake this cough that I have. So there's that. So you can pick up one of those if you're that kind of a person. All right, how the story of the Bible works. First, I just want to say the Bible is a gift to us, right? And I think there are voices in the church today that are minimizing the role of the Bible in the Christian life. Because people are discovering, sometimes for the very first time, that the Bible has some hard places. Particularly the Old Testament is suffering. There was a book published recently called The Old Testament is Dying, because it's so neglected in the life of the church. So while the Bible is a gift, it's a challenge for the church, I think, to accept the Bible, the actual Bible that God gave us, the way that He gave it to us. Because the fact is, the Bible is not an easy book. The Bible is a challenging book, in spite of what some people in the church sometimes say about it. Sometimes in our zeal to kind of protect or advocate for the Bible, we say things about the Bible that aren't really true. We say that the Bible, like if you just read it every day, you're going to have this amazing quiet time, and it's going to speak to you, and it's going to change your life. And then some people try that, and they read it, and after a while, they're like, wow, some of this is hard. Some of this I don't understand. Think about what the Bible actually is. It's a huge book. It's big. And it's actually not a single book. It's a library of different kinds of writings. And so reading the Bible is challenging. Not only that, it's from an ancient world. It's not written from today's standpoint. So many of the things we read about in the Bible, if you've ever read about Jacob and how he tried to find and manage his wives, right? That part of the story in the book of Genesis, you're like, I don't understand what the deal with mandrakes is and plants and cattle and wives and property. I mean, it's a complex, ancient world that is so different from our world in many, many ways. And so what some people try to do with a strategy is say, well, we're going to ignore those strange and hard parts of the Bible, and if you cherry pick verses, you can find the really good ones that seem like they speak just wonderful words of wisdom and inspiration and encouragement just to you. And as long as you live with those self-selected verses that are really nice, the Bible seems like it's an amazingly positive and easy book to live with. But if you read whole books, if you read the actual Bible, it suddenly becomes more challenging and more difficult. So today, I'm going to lay out for you what one crucial part of what we at the Institute for Bible Reading believe makes for good Bible reading. And then tomorrow, we're going to talk about what makes for good Bible living in the worship service here. The scriptures themselves assert that they are a divine, what modern scholars call a speech act. You know, when you go to a wedding and the couple stands up front and they say, "I do," they're just saying words. But those words are doing something in the world. When you say the words "I do" at a wedding, you're actually doing is you're making a commitment. You're making a change in the way the world is in the relationship between you and this other person, and you are bonding yourselves together. So you're not just saying words, you're actually changing things in the world simply by saying the words "I do" in a particular context. And when we think about the Bible, we need to think about a book that is filled with words, but they're not just words. The Bible itself contends that when God says things, things happen. It makes change happen in the world. And I think that's why God gave the Bible to us, in order to bring this change. And so when you read the Bible, it can convict you. It can encourage you. God makes promises. God does all kinds of things when he shares his words with us. But the only way those words will work is if we accept the Bible on its own terms. So what we're going to do today is try to work at understanding what does it mean to accept the story of the Bible on its own terms. Not assuming that the Bible is a modern book and has to fit all of our expectations as a modern book, but simply welcome the fact that it's an ancient book, that God started this story a long time ago, has been working with people for a long time, and the Bible's story catches up to us, but it starts back in that ancient world. And so we're going to look at the Bible on its own terms. Briefly, here's at the Institute for Bible Reading what we say makes for great, stellar Bible engagement. First of all, a community has to have good access to the whole library of the Scriptures, well translated and presented in their natural literary forms. I don't know if all of you are aware of the new thing that's happening in Bible publishing called Reader's Bibles. But there's a transition happening. Every modern Bible that is known around the world today is basically a reference book Bible. It's a late form of the Bible that didn't come to us until the 16th century, when chapters and verses came together in the Bible for the very first time. This will be another topic for another day. I'm not going to go into that whole history and what that happened. But what it means is, as modern Christians, we've inherited a reference book Bible that has all these little numbers and is really not built for reading, it's built for referencing. So the Institute is saying it's great to have a reference Bible. They're handy in a lot of ways. You can find a passage really fast. So there's an efficiency there. But if you just want to sit down and read the Bible at length and in depth and on its own terms, the thing to get is a reader's Bible. A reader's Bible has all the numbers taken out, all the footnotes, cross-references, section headings, everything else is out of the text, so you can just read those words the way they were made in the first place. Poetry that looks like poetry. Stories that look like stories. Proverbs that look like proverbs. So now you can really, for the first time, see the kinds of writing that the Bible is. But that's not what we're talking about today. That's the first thing that we need for stellar Bible engagement, but that's not our point today. Secondly, the church needs to regularly feast together on whole books or whole literary units that make up the Bible. Again, no time to go into that today. Number 3, the church understands the overall story of the Bible as centered in Jesus. That's where we're going to spend our time today. So the Bible is this library. It's this collection of different books, but they're not just a random collection. They work together to tell a single great story of God and the world and all of us. So that's what we're going to talk about. A story that is God's interactions with the world to bring his purposes to fruition, and that is centered on Jesus. Jesus is the center of the story. And finally, the last step in stellar Bible engagement is the church will accept the invitation to take up its own role as a community in God's ongoing drama of restoration through the power of the Spirit. That's tomorrow's sermon. All right? So we're going to talk about what does this story have to do with us today? How do we live the story of the Bible out in our own world? That's what we're going to talk about tomorrow. Today, we're going to dwell on that third point, understanding the overall story of the Bible and how it's centered in Jesus. So here, quickly, is the overview of where we're going to go in more depth as we go through this morning's session. The drama of the Bible in 6 acts. Number 1, creation. It's God's glorious intention. Act 2, rebellion. Exile from God's garden. Act 3, Israel, a new beginning. Act 4, Jesus, the Messiah's surprising victory. Act 5, new community, the good news of God's reign. And then Act 6, new creation. God himself comes home at the ending of the story. So, we're going to go through these acts, and even this. I mean, you might say, well, this is a long time we're spending this morning, and then we have a session this afternoon. All we're talking about is this overview, this 6 acts of the Bible, and it's going to be very detailed. I'm here to tell you, the Bible is a long book, and all we can do today is give you the highlights of these 6 main points of the plot line, the storyline of the Bible. So this, we can't possibly go into great detail, but what I'm hoping to do is to give you a mental map of the story of the Bible so that in your regular ongoing Bible reading, you can always say, okay, this is about Act 3, or now we're reading from Act 5, and you can place yourself on this storyline of the Bible and say, this is what's already happened, this is what hasn't happened yet, here's what I can expect to be discussing or reading about when I'm reading from this part of the Bible. I think the Bible is hard for people. I think a lot of people end up reading it in fragments, and they just try to get little bits of it here and there, and they never really understand how the whole thing fits together. Like, how does all this actually work? So what we're doing today is giving you that mental map. This afternoon, we're going to go even deeper and find threads that tie these different acts of the story deeply together, that they are connected in ways that we often haven't thought about or heard about. And then tomorrow we'll talk about living the story. So, Act 1, creation, God's glorious intention. The beginning of the creation story, the first creation story, the opening words of the Bible, God created the heavens and the earth, has this second line which is fascinating. Now the earth was tohu wa bohu. What? Those are Hebrew words. They're strong words for a Hebrew or an ancient mindset. They mean unformed and unfilled. That's really interesting. It means when the creation story starts, there was already something there. It doesn't talk about God creating something from nothing, although we believe that's what happened, right? God created everything. But the creation story itself in the Bible says the heavens and the earth were tohu wa bohu. unformed, that is empty, right? Chaotic, and then unfilled. There was nothing in it yet. So it was just this mass of material, undifferentiated. And in the ancient world, all the ancient creation stories, which is, by the way, something that doesn't scare us. I don't think it should scare us that there were other creation stories in the world, and that there are some similarities. There were also ancient flood stories in the world, and there are similarities and differences with those that we find in the Bible. And I think that's okay, because one thing it does is it helps us understand the ancient mindset that the Bible was born in, and we can say, okay, in the ancient world where other religions and other peoples were talking about the creation of the world and the role of their gods in that creation, what does the Hebrew Bible say about the creation of the world, and how is it similar, and what are the unique claims of the Hebrew Bible, our Bible, about the role of God and what he's doing in the world? But a common theme in this ancient creation stories across cultures was this element of chaos, and that we need the gods to bring order. That's the thing that is common to all the creation stories. And it's true of the creation story in our Bible. So what's actually happening is this tohu wa bohu, they are actually powers of chaos, if you will. So the way the story goes in the Bible is there are powers of chaos at work in the world, and God needs to push them back in order to make a place of beauty, of order, and fill it with the right kinds of things in the right kinds of places, so that he can have a functioning creation that will be the kind of place he wants it to be for himself and for us to live together. So, when you go through those 7 days of creation in the opening creation story, it's fascinating to see the first 3 days, God is defeating tohu. The world is chaotic, so God separates and forms things for those 3 days. The next 3 days, he fills the spaces that he created in the first 3 days with the right kind of living creature or entity for each of those spaces, appropriately. And this is order versus chaos, which is a major theme in the whole story of the Bible. So the first day, he separates light and dark. He separates the water above from the water below on the second day. On the third day, he separates the water from the dry land. So now you have water above, which creates a sky. It's held back by the firmament. You have water below that's in the sea. Then he separates the sea from the dry land. The light has been separated from the darkness on the first day of creation. So now you have the right kind of spaces, and then the next days he fills them. So the fourth day corresponds to the first day. He's created light and darkness for certain times of the day. Now he fills those with lights. So there's a sun for the daytime. There's the moon and the stars for the nighttime. He's put the right kind of things in the right kind of place, creating order. On the fifth day, he creates fish to live in the sea, birds to fly in the sky that's been created, and then on the last day, he creates the animals and the humans, creatures to live on the dry land. So this whole creation story is a battle, if you will, against the forces of chaos, and God is seen as the one who created a certain kind of place to be a good, working, functioning place for the life that he wanted to see in the world. That's what that story is about. And then you come to day 7, and God rested. And I remember thinking, okay, like we know what that's about, right? We read our understanding of things into the Bible, and we say, when we've worked hard, we want to rest. So that's what God was doing. And then just recently for me, a few years ago, I read a book by a scholar, an Old Testament scholar called John Walton, who wrote a book, The Lost World of Genesis 1. And he makes the case that the entire creation story is actually a story of the creation of a temple for God. And he quoted all these cases where actually, in the ancient world, when a deity rests or takes up his rest, what it means is he comes into his temple. And then I thought, okay, is there any scriptural reference to that? And he pointed me to Psalm 132. So the second to the last stanza of Psalm 132, now talking about the temple that God has in Jerusalem, kind of uses this idea of rest to tell us that how the creation could possibly be a temple. At the end of Psalm 132, it says, "For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling." Right? Zion, the hill mount in Jerusalem, the temple was built on top of Zion, saying, "This is my resting place forever and ever. Here I will sit enthroned, for I have desired it. I will bless her with abundant provisions. Her poor I will satisfy with food. I will clothe her priests with salvation, and her faithful people will ever sing for joy." Everyone's going to be fed. When God dwells in Zion and fills his temple, when he rests there, it says, then everything in Israel's world will function the way it's supposed to, and life will flourish. People will get food. The priests will be ministering. Worship will happen. The world will be as it's meant to be. That's a vision for what God wanted for the entire creation from the beginning. So the opening creation story is actually the story of God making a temple that he intended all along to live in with us. This, to me, was revolutionary. And it tells me the creation story is not about scientific controversies about how scientifically the world was made. That wasn't the thing in the ancient world. The thing in the ancient world was the forces of chaos that are always threatening life. Think about what it's like to live in a world where life is fragile and the forces of nature can't be controlled, and chaos is constantly threatening the life of your early civilization. I think about what's happening in the weather world today, flooding in the Midwest, these monster storms. I'm like, I think we're still living with the idea that there are forces of chaos beyond what we can control. And so maybe we can understand a little bit about what it was like in the ancient world to think the whole world was under the power of chaos, and you needed a god, a deity, to come and push back those forces, to make the chaotic waters be lifted up and be above the sky and restricted to a certain place on earth, so you had dry land and sky and sea. These are the things that the creation stories were doing. So when God takes up his rest, what it means is he's now free to enter his temple and to live there in a well-functioning world, together with all the creatures that he's made. The world is God's temple. That's the first big takeaway from the opening creation story. But a temple-making story, what about the other elements that we read about? So the first one, God's order out of chaos, we've talked about that. What does every temple in the ancient world have? Images, idols, right? Ancient peoples always created idols or an image of their God to put in their temple. So does God's creation temple have an image? Amazingly, when he creates the humans on the sixth day, he creates them in his image. Wow. So this is the one temple in the ancient world that doesn't have wood or stone carved into an image of a god. In fact, what God has done is made living images of himself and put them in his temple. So saying that humans are made in the image of God is a way of admitting that the creation is God's temple, the place he wants to live with us, and we are to be his image bearers. That is, we are the ones who are to represent God into the life of the world, for the flourishing of the life of the world. Adam and Eve were put in the garden to tend the garden, to take care of it. That's their job in the world, to make sure the rest of creation flourishes with good life, healthy life, good living. We are to be God's, he's the great king. We are to be his sub-regents. That is, the kings and queens under the high king, but over the rest of creation in order to serve the life of the rest of the creation. That's what the opening creation stories are all about. One key point that's going to be crucial for the entire story from this point on is that God does everything in this biblical story collaboratively. There are some parts and some voices sometimes I hear in churches where people kind of teach this passive Christianity, as if God does everything. My own background, if you heard, I was from Calvin College, Calvin Seminary. I'm from a deeply Reformed background, grew up in the Christian Reformed churches in Denver, right? Went to Christian school, Reformed all my life, then went to a Reformed college, then went to a Reformed seminary. I know everything you want to know about John Calvin. If you want to know about John Calvin, just ask me, right? But my tradition is sometimes prone toward the distortion of saying God's sovereignty is so strong and so powerful and so much in charge of everything that we can almost by nature have to be passive. We just sit back and watch God do everything. But the opening creation story says, no, we are his image bearers, and he intends all along. The story isn't going to go anywhere without human beings going along and being a part. So we have a significant part to play in this story. It's not just the story of God and the world. It's the story of God, the world, and his image bearers, who are meant to be significant creatures who shape and form what's happening in the world. God is going to do things for sure. And sometimes the humans are so far off the rails, he just has to do it without them. Sometimes. But mostly, what God wants is to work through his people for the good of the world. That's what the biblical story is saying. I put you as my image bearers in my temple, so you are the ones, you're my plan for managing the world. Human beings, significant creatures, the only ones out of the whole creation made in the image of God. That's what it means to be human. You alone out of the creation image God and his concern for the world and for the life of the world and for the worship of God himself. He put that in us, and that's our job. And what it says is humans have a vocation. We've been given the job just by being born human. We have, biblically, if you're following the biblical story, we have the job of tending and caring for God's world. That's job one. So before there's anything like a Christian mission and all this other stuff that we think of as what we're supposed to be doing in the world, that comes later, and it's, as we're going to see this afternoon, is related to job one. So there are other things that we are called to do as followers of Jesus and worshipers of God. But our first and permanent job is to be caretakers of God's world. That's the creation opening story. Right, Act 2. Rebellion, exile from God's garden. The essence of this rebellion, this disruption of God's intention, right, where he has his image bearers, the creation is living. After each day of the creation, God said, it's good, it's good. At the very end of the story, it says, he saw everything he had made and it was very good, right? His temple is functioning. Then suddenly discord comes breaking in. There's a rebellion. And we don't get the backstory of the serpent, right? I mean, it's weird when you read the second creation story. The serpent just shows up. And you're like, wait, where did this serpent come from? And apparently somebody's already in rebellion to God and now trying to influence his image bearers, right? Just taking the Bible story on its own terms, like there is no backstory on the serpent. Just shows up, and it's some other kind of creature, which, as we will see, has an ongoing role to play in the story, against God and trying to disrupt his plan for his creation temple and influence, he's not trying to influence anything else in the creation other than the image bearers. The serpent goes after the image bearers because the serpent knows the image bearers are the ones who are over the world. They manage the world. And the way the image bearers go is the way the whole creation will go. The image bearers and the creation are intimately tied together. Adam is simply the Hebrew word for ground, right? Adam was made from Adamah. The man was made from the ground. And so the humans and the people, and the land, the creation, they go together. And the destiny of one will be the destiny of the other. That's crucial to the whole biblical story. So, as a result of the rebellion, which, by the way, was essentially about independence from God. So the kings and queens of creation, under the high king, decided, they were tempted. The whole story is about, can you go your own way, and can you raise your own status by doing something to learn more, to know more, to be like God, in order that you can raise your status in the world and be even higher beings. It's about independence from God, going your own way, and raising yourself up. That's what that temptation is about. That's why when we get to some crucial player later in the story, like Act 4, right? We'll pretend we don't know about that yet. We don't know the name of that person yet. But somebody's going to come who's going to reverse the temptation that Adam and Eve fell to in terms of raising themselves up. And in fact, what his whole strategy is to lower himself consecutively, as we'll see when we look at another passage. So, God actually takes the radical step of leaving his temple. Remember, second creation story, what does God do? He walks in the garden with Adam and Eve. They see God every day, and they have intimate fellowship and connection. That's the story of God's functioning creation temple. That's the way God wants to live here with us. Like directly be in his presence right here with us on earth. That was his founding intention. And then God says, if you're going to go your own way, then the earth can no longer be my temple. And so then there's this separation in the biblical story between heaven and earth. That's why we think of heaven and earth as different places. And actually what we're going to see is, contrary, I'll just give you a preview. I have a hard time not getting to the end of the story, but you're going to get hints about that. But some tellings of the Christian story make it seem as if heaven and earth are separated forever, and therefore the goal of the Christian life is to get to heaven, to the other place, to leave earth and go to heaven. One explanation for the word Bible I've heard around is basic instruction before leaving earth. Right? I'm telling you right now, that is not true to the biblical story. The biblical story is about the reunification of heaven and earth. And what we're going to see is God, beginning with his first answer to this rebellion, God doesn't give up. He's like, oh, that was an interesting experiment. Let's just let them go their own way and I'm done with them. God stays with his project. And the first things he starts doing is bringing heaven back down to earth in little pieces. So the Jakob story, early in Genesis, Jacob sees a ladder connecting heaven and earth. Right? And as the story goes on, we're going to see more incursions from heaven into earth as God slowly recolonizes the place he lost to the rebellion. There's been a rebellion, but God is going to fight to retake it. Think about the loss of Europe to Nazism and Hitler. Right? What did the Allies have to do? They had to step by step. First they had to have D-Day, where they went back onto the shores of Europe and got a foothold so that they could start to take back Europe and then end up, finally going all the way to Berlin. That's not a bad image to have for how the story of the Bible works. God has lost his creation to the rebellion. The rebellion infects everything. It changes everything in his story. Right? When the humans rebel, God says the land is cursed in Genesis 3. Now when you try to grow things, instead of them just flourishing the way I intended easily, now you have to work hard. You have to sweat. Things are going to break. You're going to plow and the plow is going to break. And suddenly work isn't easy anymore. The life that creation tries to give you comes hard. Right? People struggle with their jobs. This is the curse that's on the creation as a result of human rebellion. That's what God was going to start working to overcome. Fascinating. In the words of promise that God gives to Adam and Eve after he confronts them about their rebellion, notice he doesn't say, okay, now sit back and watch, and I will undo your sin and I will save the world. He says, it will be the seed of the woman that will crush the serpent. That's huge. That's a huge thing. What it means is God is committed to working with people for the whole length of the entire story. The collaboration is always what the story is going to be about. As I said, sometimes God just has to just do things himself, and he will break in and do it without human help. But his preferred mode of doing his work in the world is in collaboration with his image bearers. His image bearers are made, they were meant to be and made to be people who bring his purposes to bear in the world. So when things go south, right away, I mean, seriously, Genesis 3, how far into the Bible story are we? This has gone south really fast. It didn't take long. But God just immediately promises, I'm going to work with you. It's going to be a human person, the seed of the woman. It has to be a human who will defeat the serpent, not just God. Because God made the world to be a certain way under the rule of humans, that's the way the whole story is going to go. So don't diminish the role of humans. My tradition sometimes can tend to do that with its big emphasis on the glory and the sovereignty of God. Now granted, God is the number one player in the drama, right? There's no player in the drama who can do what God can do, for sure, right? Let's not forget that. But let's not diminish the human role in the story, and the human role, as we see, will continue into our own day. What we are meant to be in the world is based on this creation understanding of being image bearers in God's temple. And God does not abandon that. Even when they go wrong, God says, I will continue to work with you and the human race in order to correct this. And because it's us, it means it's going to be a long and painful journey, right? It's going to be hard. And sometimes when you're reading the Old Testament, which we like to call the First Testament, not to disparage it as old and irrelevant, sometimes when you're reading that story of Israel, you're like, this is going nowhere. This is just a disaster. And it's one disaster after another. And what, this isn't progressively getting better, right? This is just getting worse. Like, have you ever read the book of Judges? Like, that's a disaster, right? It starts out kind of okay because Israel's in the promised land. By the end, right, the tribes are killing each other and they're cutting up women and sending her body parts to different tribes. I'm like, this is not a good story. This is a hard story. And that's because our rebellion, because we're significant creatures, our rebellion was significant, and therefore our rebellion affects everything. It gets into everything, and it ruins life. That's what God is working to overcome. In fact, this unnamed person who's coming in Act 4, at one point he says, when certain parties, religious parties of his day, ask him why he's working on the Sabbath, he says, I am working and my Father is working every day to overcome this rebellion. That's what that's about. All right, we've had Act 1 on creation and Act 2 on the rebellion. Act 3. Israel, a new beginning. Really, it could be called the calling of Abraham's family, because Abraham is the beginning of the Israel story. Abraham is the one God calls, and it's his family that will grow into the nation Israel, but it's through them, through his family, that he commits to working. But first, let me just say about one more thing that happens just before the Abraham story. In the Bible, the Noah story, which comes just before the call of Abraham, if you think about it, right? Remember what God did in the days of creation where he separated the water above from the water below, and then the water into the sea from the dry land, so that water was put in its place appropriately. Water was also a well-known symbol of chaos in the ancient world. So, like right in the beginning of the creation story, God is getting water under control. What is the flood story in a world like that? It's the unleashing of the chaotic forces of water once again. So God is it's amazing in the biblical story in the early chapters of Genesis how quickly things get so bad. It starts off with this little independence movement by Adam and Eve. But then their children are killing each other. And then you get people like saying, if someone hurts me, I will take vengeance like 7 times what they did to me. Like evil escalates in the biblical story quickly. And God looks down and he's like, I kind of regret I made this whole story get started. Maybe this drama is out of control bad and I should end it right here. There are in fact other points in the biblical story where God says, I'm so frustrated with you, right? I committed to working with humans, but I'm so frustrated by what they're doing, I might just have to wash the entire stage clean. So God unleashes the flood. So the waters of chaos that he had pushed back in the creation story, he lets them loose. And they flood the entire earth. And chaos rules again. And God is washing the stage of the drama. I want you to think of creation, the heavens and the earth. John Calvin, I'm sorry, I have to bring him up a little bit, called them the stage of God's glory. The creation is the place where God is going to work out what he's doing, and it's the place he's going to showcase his glory. Remember that place in the Psalms where it says, the glory of the Lord will fill the heavens and the earth? The whole earth will be filled with his glory. The stage is the place where God wants to reveal his glory. So when the flood story happens, God says, it's almost like there's like a new beginning. And Noah kind of functions as a second Adam, right? He inherits the world again. So the floodwaters come, wash away all the wickedness that God could not take anymore. The wickedness had grown so great that it says that God's heart hurt. This is a strong emotional reaction that the Bible says God had when he saw how wicked, how destructive, how violent human beings had become. So he washes the stage clean, saves one family and an ark full of creatures in order to just start over the world again. So, the Noahic covenant. After that, the first covenant that God makes in the Bible, he says to Noah, and actually he says, I'm making a covenant with all the living creatures on earth. It's not just with Noah and his family. It's with every living creature on earth, saying, I will never flood the world like this again. Whatever else I do to the world, and with you wicked people in the world, I will not do this again. I can't keep flooding the world and trying to do restarts. So this was a one-time thing. And he promises to take care of the creation in order that the story can work itself out. That's what the covenant with Noah and all the living creatures is about. So that comes just before the Abraham story. So now, the huge question in the biblical drama from the early chapters in Genesis is, things have gone wrong in my creation temple. So what am I, as the author of the story, going to do about it? Abraham is the first biblical answer. The first thing God is going to do about the rebellion of his image bearers in the garden is choose one man and his family in order to bring blessing and life back to the world. That's what the opening Abraham story is all about. The word curse shows up 5 times in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. 5 times in the first opening verses of chapter 12, God uses the word bless. God is going to overcome the curse that has come on the land by bringing blessing back to the world through Abraham. So just like Adam and Eve were made with a vocation to be image bearers in the world, Abraham was called to a vocation. This is a big deal in the Bible. What's your vocation? Meaning, what is your purpose? What is your job in the world? The Bible has an answer for that. And it's first of all to be people who tend God's creation temple. The second thing that he calls and gives somebody else a vocation is Abraham and his family are called to be the people through whom God will bring blessing, not curse, blessing, back to all the peoples on earth. So that's their opening job description in the Bible. And that will go for his family. That goes for the nation of Israel. Whatever else Israel is to do in the world, that's their job one. Bring blessing back to all the nations, all the people on earth. So the family of Abraham grows into 12 tribes. It goes down to Egypt because of a famine. It's interesting you get these little hints of things, right? So the Joseph stories. It's a big part of the book of Genesis is what's happened with Joseph. What does he do while he's down in Egypt? He grows into this amazing position of authority after being a slave and traded as a slave. He brings blessing to Egypt by coming up with a plan to save them from their famine. So already we see Abraham's family is bringing blessing back and life. He made a plan to save food so that Egypt could get through the famine. Abraham's family is bringing blessing to the nations of the world. But basically what happens with the family, so we have the 12 sons of Jacob. They grow into big tribes. They are enslaved eventually in Egypt. What this does is set the stage for the great act of redemption, which will be the template or the pattern for all of God's acts of salvation in the story from here on out. The Exodus, when God saves Israel from slavery, brings them Torah, sets up the sacrificial system, brings them into their own land, that is the mega event in Israel's story. The story that conditions all other stories. So whatever else happens to Israel in this story, they get their commission from their father Abraham to be a light to the world, to bring blessing to the world. They get their founding charter in the Exodus. The Exodus is the thing that will, from this point on, even into the New Testament, will shape the way that God's salvation goes. It's going to be an Exodus, and then in the prophets we're going to see them talking about a new Exodus, another Exodus, because we've been enslaved all over again. So think about all the things that God does in the Exodus. He proclaims himself Israel's father. It's the first time in the Bible the word father is used of God. That's interesting. So Moses goes before Egypt, before Pharaoh, and God tells him, "Tell Pharaoh that Israel is my firstborn son, and I am Israel's father." Before that, we have the name Yahweh, Elohim. We have these names for God, but this is the first time. It's a groundbreaking move where God says, I'm creating not just a God and people, but I'm creating a new family on earth, and I'm going to be their father. So I'm not just king, I'm not just God, I'm father. So whenever we hear the word father referred to God in the Bible, we should be thinking Exodus. It's an Exodus term first of all. That's when God said, Israel is my firstborn, and I love Israel, and I'm coming down to rescue my family because Israel's my son, and I heard Israel's cry for help under slavery, and I'm coming down to help. This coming down to help is also part of the pattern. Pharaoh, for his part, says, excuse me, who is Yahweh? I know the names of a lot of gods. The Egyptians had a lot of gods. He says, you'll have to tell me about Yahweh because I don't know who Yahweh is. So God says, okay, I will show you who Yahweh is. And then we get the 12 plagues. And what God does is he makes his name known on earth. Another part of the pattern of the story. God makes his name known to Israel first. The name Yahweh is revealed to Moses in the incident with the burning bush. That's when God reveals the name Yahweh. And then Yahweh becomes known to his people. And then Yahweh becomes known to the nations of the earth. First Egypt and then the others. This is also how it's going to go. Israel is going to know Yahweh first and foremost. But the point of Israel's existence is to share the knowledge of who Yahweh is with the rest of the world, to be a showcase people. You could say that Israel was called to be a display case for what does life look like when God runs the show. That's what Torah was all about. Not really law so much as instruction and teaching. I think we mistranslate Torah when we call it just law. It sounds like laws you have to obey and you get arrested if you don't do it. There was more instruction is the word, right? Teaching, guiding us into the life that God wants. So God saves them from Egypt. Then what does he do with them? Gives them Torah, which includes a sacrificial system. He creates a tabernacle. Out in the wilderness, God says, look, I am coming back down out of all the places on earth. I'm going to send my presence to be right in your midst. When Israel camped out in the wilderness, the tribes arranged themselves in all four directions, 3 tribes around all 4 of the directions, so that Israel's tabernacle was in the middle and the tribes surrounded it. So God was literally in the middle of the tribes. I don't know if you've ever thought about the furniture that's in the tabernacle. Do you know the different elements? All the elements in the tabernacle reflect parts of God's creation. It's amazing. There are lights to create like stars. There's a big uncut rock. There's a basin with water in it that represents the sea. What God is doing is recreating a microcosm of the whole world in the middle of Israel. And then he's coming down and he's going to send his presence to be on the Ark of the Covenant right in the Holy of Holies in the middle of the creation. Does this sound familiar? This sound like the opening creation story where God makes a temple and then he comes down to live with Adam and Eve in his temple? So he's lost the world to the rebellion, if you will. But now God says, I'm coming back. I'm coming back and I'm calling one people. I'm going to bring them into one land, the promised land, and I am going to live with them in that land. So I'm not taking back the whole world at once, but he creates a little world within the bigger world as like the starting place to reclaim the entire creation as his temple. That's what the Israel story is about. Do you ever wonder about that story in Numbers about when they send spies into the land? Remember when they come back? What are they carrying? They're carrying like fruit where it takes 2 guys to hold up this one cluster of grapes on a pole, right? Because they're so big and flourishing and overwhelming. They're bringing back the fruit of the land, and you're like, really? That's what Israel is like? Israel is like the Garden of Eden was meant to be. Israel is what the world was meant to be. When Israel functions in the promised land under God's blessing, it flourishes like the garden of God. Israel is the beginning of God's reclamation of the whole world. So God lives with them. The tabernacle is like all the elements of creation are within it, symbolizing that God is coming to live with his people. But even more than that, he's creating a little world. So the whole world is meant to be God's temple. And in the Bible story, Israel's tabernacle and temple represent the whole world. So those things go together. One thing we learn, sadly, in the Israel story is that the rebellion of Act 2 has not gone away. So everybody that God chooses to work with in the story of the Bible is still infected with this seed, this rebellious spirit, and we see it immediately in Israel. Right? I mean, he just saves them. They just go out to the desert. Right? Moses is up on the mountain getting the Torah. And what do? The first thing they do is rebel against God and make an idol. You're like, you people are hopeless. And they're like, why wouldn't God send another flood? And in fact, he has these conversations, which if we're not careful, we won't take seriously. But God has these conversations with Moses, again, expressing extreme disappointment with Israel. So Abraham was supposed to be the answer to Adam. Like if Adam goes wrong, the rabbis would say later in the Mishnah, if Adam goes wrong, I'll send Abraham to sort it all out. That's what the rabbis said about what Yahweh said about Adam and Abraham. So now he's chosen Abraham and Abraham's family, but they're just as bad as Adam and Eve were in the garden. The same thing keeps happening. So God has these amazing conversations with Moses. And he says, you know what? Maybe I'll just wipe them out and start over with you and your family. Or, God, like early in the Bible story, God is like, his solution or his first instinct is, like, I just got to wipe you out and start over. I have to keep starting over because you're not getting with the program. But Moses talks him down. Really? Like, that's amazing. Like, do we think the drama of the Bible is real? Or do we think that was a fake conversation? Like, was God real in that conversation? Was that a real conversation, or were they just acting? And I think it's like a question, do we take the drama of the Bible seriously? That God takes our actions seriously, and what we do affects how the drama goes, and it affects what God is going to do. Again, I'll reference my own tradition, right? My tradition tends toward sometimes saying the plan of God is so secure and strong that it just works itself out no matter what we do. When I read the Bible, I see God interacting with people in a way that takes them significantly as creatures who have a free will and whose choices matter to the direction of the story. God is overseeing it, and he can make things happen in amazing ways. So we don't have control of the story. God does. But we are significant enough creatures that God has to interact with what we do, and he has to respond to it. And sometimes it changes what God's going to do because of what we've done, as we will see later in the story. So Israel gets into the promised land. They're given Torah. They're set up as to be a new Garden of Eden in the land. If you read the blessings and curses at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, which was the final sermon that Moses gave to the people just before they went into the land, you read the blessings section, sounds just like a functioning Garden of Eden. If Israel obeys Torah, worships God, lives well, then God is going to bless the land, and they hardly have to work to make things grow. Remember when the curse on the work and land came in Genesis 3? That's getting undone in the story. But as I said, the rebellion in Act 2 is real, and it continues to infect people. So they get in the land, Joshua dies, they don't have a king yet, they have judges. And the book of Judges is a book of cycles of people just going around and around. God saves them, they rebel, they get into trouble, he has to come and save them again. And it ends with this disastrous story where the closing line is, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, making the case for a king. So Israel gets a king, and the story moves on. There's a new covenant. There was Noah, there was Abraham, Moses. A covenant is moving the story ahead in each case. Now he makes a covenant with King David and says, I am going to work with you and your family as the way to lead my people forever. So just like God made a commitment to human beings to always work with humans, now he makes a commitment saying that his people Israel, who are his answer to what's gone wrong in the world, will always be led by someone from David's family. So he blesses King David, and he commits to long-term David's line being the leaders of his people Israel. The tabernacle becomes the temple. There's this glorious scene in Kings, the book of Kings, where God's presence comes down and fills this new temple. They have a huge party. Again, it's restoration in a world that is still under the forces of chaos and rebellion. God is working through his people Israel. And then we get the kings that follow David. And it just gets worse and bad and worse and bad again. And a little bit okay, a little revival under this king. But the overall storyline is one of decline. Until finally, the unimaginable happens. And God has to kick his people out of the new Garden of Eden. And you see the parallel? Just like Adam and Eve, who didn't live into God's vocation for them, had to be sent out of the garden, right? Out of the presence of God, away from the tree of life. Now, the people of the second Adam, Abraham, whose family was to be the answer to what's gone wrong with Adam, now they've gone wrong. So now we have a double problem. The whole human race is infected with this rebellion. It affects the whole creation. And now God's answer to that has gone wrong. So now God has a real tragedy on his hands. Like, how is this story not a tragedy? His answer to the problem is itself now part of the problem. The prophets of Israel say, you're no better than the nations around you. You're supposed to be a light to the nations about what life looks like when you're living with me, and you are no such thing. And so he sends them out. And it's a tragedy as big as the opening exile from the garden is. Both stories end with exile. And at this point, anybody reading the story just has to say, the end? Like, is this over? God, do you have like another option? Like, are you going to give up on Israel? Maybe that's not your answer to the problem. Are you going to give up on humanity? Maybe they're like incurable. Maybe they're incorrigible. Maybe they aren't people who can be worked with. And Israel doesn't seem to be an answer at all. Israel's now kicked out of the land. So they come back to the land, but you notice they try building another temple, but you get no story like that one in 1 Kings where God's presence comes down and fills the temple. God's presence doesn't return. Interesting. They have a temple, but now they have no presence of God. No visible, tangible sign that God is dwelling with them again. So as the Old Testament, the First Testament ends, you're just left with a story that is hanging, and nothing has been solved yet in the storyline. God has started some things, but they haven't produced answers yet. There's no satisfaction that what God, remember, we always have to go back to what did God intend from the start? What does the creation story tell us about what God wants in the world? And when we get to the end of the First Testament, we ask, is any of that happening? And we have to say, it's not happening. It's not happening yet. And so by the time we get to the coming of the new part of the story, the New Testament, and the birth of Jesus the Messiah, Israel is now centuries under the oppression of foreign powers and is begging God to come and do something. Israel at this point is saying, like, they're struggling with whether this story is even true anymore. Because this whole story of God calling us, like, is God really even for us? That's why the famous Jewish historian Josephus, he actually looked at the world situation and said, actually, I think God has gone over to the Romans. I don't think he's chosen us. I think he's unchosen us. And now God is with the Romans. Because look, they run the whole world. They create peace and order. The Romans are now God's chosen people. That's amazing. I mean, that's the tension for Israel's faith in a story that has not gone right, and it's been a long, long time coming. So it's into this world that Jesus of Nazareth comes and makes the big announcement that Israel's exile is ending. We have to hear the words of Jesus in a first century context. What Jesus is saying when he comes, he says, I'm here to bring the forgiveness of sins and the kingdom of God is at hand. What Jesus is saying is, I'm not just talking about you and you and you having your sins individually, forgiven and dealt with. I'm talking about, as they would say in Texas, all y'all, right? The nation of Israel, the community is being forgiven. Israel is going to be forgiven so that I can reestablish Israel. I am coming, God is coming as king. That's why Jesus is always, always, always talking about the kingdom of God. Jesus announces and lives and shows what the kingdom of God looks like. So Jesus is a kingdom person. He's an Israel person. He's reliving Israel's story. He chooses how many disciples? 12. Symbolically recreating the 12 tribes of Israel, showing that God is not done with Israel. Sometimes Christians read the New Testament as if it's like, yeah, God just says no to Israel and everything that came before because that didn't work out. So it's just like another new start. As if Jesus were another Abraham or Noah or something. Like he's just like, okay, I'm done with Israel. Let's start over with the Christian Jesus. All four Gospels open with references to the story of Israel that came before. All four of them. John opens with the creation story. The other three open with references to Israel's story, right? Luke takes Jesus' genealogy back through Israel, but then all the way back to Adam, showing where that the backstory matters and that Jesus is born precisely into the ongoing story. It's a huge thing, I think, for us to read the stories of Jesus, to read the Gospels, knowing that Jesus is intentionally working out the subplots and the plots that came in Israel's story and humanity's story before him. This is what he's doing all the time. He is showing that he is the essence of a renewed Israel, that he is the essence of a renewed humanity, and that he is bringing God's reign, God as creator king, he's bringing that reign back to earth. So Jesus relives Israel's story, this time with the correct ending. Right? What happened to Adam and Eve in the garden when they were tempted? They failed. What happened to Israel when they were just saved and brought out into the wilderness? They fall to temptation and they create an idol. So Jesus, redoing the Israel story, goes out into the wilderness at the beginning of his ministry, and he also is tempted, just like Adam and Eve, just like Israel. But this time, for the first time, a human, a member of the nation of Israel, passes the temptation test. So Jesus is reliving the story, but it will all be with a different outcome. He is the new man. He is the new Israelite. And he will live the story differently to make the whole thing work out the way God intended it to from the start. So Jesus' ministry from top to bottom is a kingdom ministry. What he speaks, what he does, his miracles were not about proving that he was God. His miracles were about restoring the creation to what God always intended the creation to be. Right? When you read the blessings in Deuteronomy, it's like the crops multiply like miraculously. Jesus gets a little bit of bread, he turns it into a meal for 5,000. This is not just proving that Jesus is God. That wasn't really the question in first century Israel for Jesus. It's whether or not he was the Messiah. That's the question. And then when Jesus does nature miracles, right, the waters of chaos were not meant to overwhelm their boat. Remember the creation story, putting the water in its place? The flood story, which was an uncreation and the waters are unleashed. So when they're on the little lake of Galilee and the storm comes up, Jesus calms the storm, which is calming the waters of chaos once again. He's acting like the creator. He's creating the world the way the world is supposed to be. Nature creation was not meant to destroy human lives. So the reclamation of the world, the coming of God's reign, puts the world back at peace and well-fed and healed. All the consequences of the rebellion are being undone in the ministry of Jesus. And then the big thing. I know we're going a little bit over, but we will still have time for questions, I promise. So, the big thing that Israel's Messiah was expected to do in Israel's tradition was fight Israel's battles. Right? David, even before he's known to be anointed as king, he represents Israel and goes out and fights Goliath. And what happens? Israel's king wins against all odds, showing that Yahweh is with him. So from that point on, everybody expects if Yahweh is going to be with this person who claims to be Israel's Messiah, and there were lots of them in the first century, lots of people claiming to be the promised Messiah, lots of them losing. Jesus comes. He spends the latter part of his ministry talking about the battle that he's going to fight, but he's changing the terms of the battle. He's saying, this is not about like gathering up the zealots, getting the bandits out of the mountains and raising an army to fight Rome. Jesus starts talking about defeating the evil one. A big part of his ministry was casting out demons. And he uses the language that says, when the strong man comes, Satan loses and runs away. The strong man can bind the one who is the ruler of Israel and the ruler of this world, spiritually speaking. He's not talking about Rome. He's defeating the darker spiritual powers that are behind every oppressor of Israel. Because the story tells us, right, if you defeat Rome, what happens? There's always another empire who's willing to come along and fight. So it was Egypt, then it was the Philistines, then it's the Assyrians, then it's the Babylonians, then the Greeks come, and then the Syrians, and then the Romans, right? One oppressor after another. If you defeat them, it's never a final victory. Jesus says, I'm done with that. I'm Israel's Messiah, but I'm changing the terms of who I'm fighting, and I'm fighting the darker spiritual powers that are behind this whole battle, this whole war, this whole struggle on earth. That's who Jesus is going to fight. And when he starts talking this way, nobody follows with him, right? Nobody tracks with him. His own disciples, right? They're on the way to Jerusalem in the Gospel of Mark. And they think he's going there to be declared king and to rule the way kings always rule. So the disciples are talking amongst themselves. Who's going to sit on his right and who's going to sit on his left? Two brothers are conspiring to get Jesus to agree to put them there without the other disciples knowing. Is this like human politics or what? Right? And these are Jesus' disciples, vying for power in his coming kingdom that they are sure is coming because they've seen his works. So Jesus calls them aside and says, no. I'm going to Jerusalem to die. And it says in the text, they did not understand what he was saying. Right? They are not tracking with Jesus. They're Jesus talks about fighting a battle, but then he talks about going to Jerusalem and dying, and they can't put the pieces together. So at the end of the day, Israel's Messiah goes out, and he's killed on a Roman cross, and who is with him? Who scatters when he's arrested? All his closest 12 disciples. Right? You know how David had 3 mighty men in the story? So Jesus had 3, the inner circle of the 12, right? Peter, James, and John. They abandon him. John is the only one who comes back at the cross with the women. Right? The women stay at the cross and see Jesus die. The disciples are nowhere to be seen because they don't understand what he's doing. They don't understand that the battle of Jesus was a paradoxical battle. It's a subversive battle. And when everybody thought Jesus was losing as yet another would-be Jewish Israel Messiah, Jesus was actually winning. Paul says it was exactly at that moment on the cross that Jesus defeated the spiritual powers of evil. Humiliated them, in fact. They thought they were killing him, and he was, by that very act of a self-sacrificial death, defeating evil of its central power, and the resurrection vindicates him in that, raises him back around and says he was condemned by a Jewish and a Roman court as not being Israel's king, but God raised him from the dead and said, yes, he is Israel's king. It reestablishes that Jesus was the Messiah. That's what the resurrection does. So it's this paradoxical battle that Israel never saw coming because none of their previous rulers had fought battles this way, right? Only Jesus did this, and it was a battle no one else could see coming. So then there's this period after his resurrection where Jesus has to instruct his disciples, now that they can see that it's Jesus, they see the wounds from the cross, and they're like, what was going on? We don't understand. So Jesus explains to them how the scriptures had foretold that this is exactly the way the story had to go. This is the way that Israel actually will bring blessing and life back to the world. So then Jesus sends out his disciples in a kind of a new creation event. In the upper room, I don't know if you've ever noticed that phrase in John's gospel where it says Jesus breathed on them and they received the Holy Spirit. That sounds like the beginning of the creation story when God breathed life into humans for the first time. So now Jesus breathes on his disciples as the nucleus of a new humanity to go out and spread this news about the surprising victory of Jesus with the rest of the world. So Act 5 is this Jesus has fought the decisive battle. He's been a surprising Messiah. Act 5, which, by the way, is the act we are still living in, is the creation of a new people of God, not tied to one ethnic people anymore. Now all peoples on earth are invited in to be members of God's family so that they can call God Father, not just Israel. And they can be a part of God's kingdom on earth. And Paul says, when he's speaking in the book of Acts, it's in chapter 13, you can read it. He's in Pisidian Antioch, and he's challenged by the Jews about what he's doing. And he quotes Isaiah, and he says, we are the fulfillment of the passage in Isaiah, prophesying that Israel will be a light to the nations. He says, we are the ones, the followers of the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, who was raised from the dead. That event caused the barriers to come down between people. So now the vocation of Abraham can be fulfilled that Israel was all along meant to be doing, bringing blessing to all the peoples on earth. Paul says, yep, that's us. Christian missions is about fulfilling the vocation of Israel to bring blessing and life and God's kingdom, the news of it, of Jesus' victory, bringing that to all the nations on earth. And so the mission has been focused on Israel. It came down to being focused on one person, Jesus, as a representative of Israel. And then once Jesus turns the tide of the story in a way that no one else in the story had been able to even come close to, then suddenly the story can go outward once again. The creation story was about the whole world. Ever since then, the story has been narrowing, coming down to Abraham, his family, David, Jesus. But now that the decisive turning point has happened in the storyline, the news about that victory can work itself out as the news goes to all peoples on earth. So Jesus tells his disciples, the ending of Matthew's gospel, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. I'm going to be ascended. I'm going to be with the Father, but I am with you always. I've breathed on you the Holy Spirit. Now you are empowered to go out and be God's people in the world. And so we are the continuing story of that reclamation project where God is claiming the world for his own. Jesus is Lord not just of his people. He says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Jesus is Lord of all people and all the earth. It's a reclaiming of God's creation temple. And then finally, Act 6, which we haven't seen yet. And all you get is glimpses of it in the biblical story. But the ending of the story is not people dying and going to heaven. Right? That happens. But the ending of the story is the return of Jesus and the resurrection from the dead and God reclaiming a new heaven and a new earth. And it says God will live in the city, in the New Jerusalem, the last 2 chapters of the Bible. God will live with his people. There will be a new tree of life. Right? The beginning and the end of the Bible are like bookends, telling the same story of God's intention. What God intended at the beginning, he brings at the end. Jesus has won the victory. He is the seed of the woman who crushed the serpent. So that's why the humanity of Jesus matters as much as the divinity of Jesus. It wasn't just God doing things. It was a human living the human story the way it was meant to be lived. He's the template for a new human race, for us. The Christian mission is about inviting people back into being truly human. That's the way the Bible tells the story. So when that happens, the tree of life is there, and it says, the fruit of the tree grew on both sides of the river that runs through the city. And the fruit of the tree was for the healing of the nations. Wow. It's a big, glorious vision. Right? 4 years ago, my father died. And, I was part of his funeral and talking to lots of people about that. And we were being, cared for by the church. But there was this little version of the Christian story that was a part of that, the way many people talk to me about that. And I realized some people think that's the end of the story. That when we die, our bodies go into the ground, right? Our souls go up to heaven, and we're with Jesus happily living forever, ever after. And I think they're not like working with the actual biblical end of the story. The biblical end of the story is, yes, our spirits are with Jesus when we die. But that's not the thing that really matters. What really matters, and we don't know much about that existence either, by the way. Biblically, there's no big description about what life is like when our spirits are with Jesus now for this interim period, kind of this time between our death and our resurrection. The resurrection happens when Jesus returns, when he makes the whole world new, when there's a new heaven and a new earth. In Acts, it's called the restoration of all things. In Colossians, it says that Jesus died to bring the reconciliation between everything on heaven and earth with God. So there's this beautiful description of a holistic recovery. And so when I think about my father, who I lost, what I am most excited about is not seeing him in heaven when I die, right? What I'm most excited about, that my father's life will be given back to him and we will live together in a new creation that is without the rebellion, without the curse, doing the work we were made to do in the first place. The human vocation will still be there, and we will be working with Jesus, our human representative, our king, living in God's creation temple and doing the work that he wanted humans to do, making culture, creating things, doing things, working the land. That's the biblical vision that we actually have in the Bible. I think that's enough for one big overview of the Bible. I don't know if you could keep up with all that writing, but there will be a video of this. But we do have some time. Lunch is at noon, but we have time for questions, right, Chuck?
We do. Oh, yeah, we do. There'll be a test later. Have you written the test yet?
Yes, it's in the book.
Okay. So I was fascinated by that whole idea that no images in ancient Near East temples, but God created us in his image, and we're kind of that. So are there other differences between the creation stories in the ancient Near East and creation stories in our Bible?
The differences?
Yeah. What makes the creation story unique?
Well, in the creation stories of the other nations, I mean, if you've read, the Gilgamesh epic and some of these other ones, the thing is, the gods in those stories are as bad as the humans are in our story. The gods are warring, chaotic creatures who are backstabbing. They're competitive. They're jealous of each other. They're just like a projection of human wrongdoing onto the realm of the deities. So the big difference is like the place that God has in the Bible's creation story is he is above the fray in the sense that he's not part of the problem. And so that's why pagan religions around Israel, I think they were always about, look, these gods are irrational and they might go off on you at any moment. So you have to constantly sacrifice to them just to keep them from being like going crazy on you, right? Because they're unpredictable beings. Whereas in the Bible story, God is the force who creates order out of chaos, and he is always a force for goodness, for flourishing, for life. Whereas in the pagan stories, besides this image difference being a part of it, the gods themselves are part of the ongoing chaos.
Fascinating. Who's got a question?
Okay, so you said back in Act 3 that the calling of Abraham's family was to bring blessings to the earth. So without being political, can you address modern Israel in that scope?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that more this afternoon, so that might help. Not modern Israel so much, but especially the ways in which Jesus, the Messiah, in multiple ways, right, shows that his whole movement is about the renewal of Israel. So I think biblically, I don't want to get too political about modern day Israel and what they're doing or not doing or should be doing or any of that, or even as a fulfillment of prophecy, but I know this about the Bible. I know that Jesus is presented as the fulfillment of Israel's story par excellence. There is no fulfillment of Israel's story without Jesus. He's walking around with 12 people. He crosses the Jordan River. He's entering the land again, right, and calling 12. It's at every step of the way. He goes up on the mountain and delivers a new sermon, a new Torah, right, the Sermon on the Mount. There are so many ways in which Jesus is shown as actually reliving Israel's story, bringing it to its proper conclusion. He is Israel's Messiah. He's the son of David. So just say one thing about that. To say that there is an Israel that is Israel apart from Jesus, I don't think the Bible can do that anymore. That there is no Israel without Jesus. Paul writes to the Corinthians, every promise that God ever made to Israel is yes in Jesus. Nowhere else, only in Jesus. So we can talk about that more, and it might come up this afternoon actually when we talk about the threads between all the plots and subplots. But yeah, that's a good question.
Elizabeth?
I know we've talked some about this over the years, Glenn, but it just occurred to me, with Easter coming, most Christians that I talk to say, oh good, it proves he was God. That's what Easter's all about.
Right.
I don't believe that. I believe he was God, but I don't think that's the point of Easter or the resurrection. When in church history did that change? Because certainly the early church saw the resurrection event as proof that he was who he said he was, that he was in fact the Messiah.
Yep.
When did it switch over to, okay, he's God, he's divine? Because they weren't expecting a Messiah who was God.
Right. They were expecting the son of David.
Right, which he was. When did that change in church history?
Right. I think it was a gradual thing, because what happened is, as Christianity, the early Christian movement, which was, we know, completely a Jewish movement at first, right? It was totally birthed within Judaism. So it was Jewish people who believed Jesus was their Messiah. And then as it spreads out into the lands of the Gentiles, and people become Christians who have no background in Judaism, over time, the story became farther and farther removed from Israel's story, to where we got to the point in church history where anti-Semitism kind of became like the defining way of being a Christian, is you're against the Jews. And we started reading that into the New Testament, that God was basically saying no to the Jews in the coming of Jesus in the New Testament and saying yes to something else. So we've de-Judaized our gospel, if you will. And I think what's been great about what's happening really in the scholarly world in the last 100 years or so is we're rediscovering the actual story of Jesus in first century Judaism and reading it as a Jewish story. And it's amazing when you read the Gospels, right? The question always is whether Jesus is the Messiah. It's never like, are you the Son of God in the sense of, are you the second person of the Trinity? That's a thing that the church worked out later, right? And said there was more happening there than just the human Son of David. There's more going on with Jesus. But that comes slowly, right? And there are huge windows into that, even in the Gospels. But the overriding question is, are you the Messiah? When Jesus pulls aside his disciples and says, who do the people say I am? And then he turns to them and says, who do you say I am? Peter answers for the disciples and says, you are the Messiah. So they've been given the insight to see that Jesus really is Israel's promised Messiah, which says the whole mission and point of Jesus is to fulfill Israel's story. I just think it happened over church history. We moved away from the connection with Jesus and the Israel story, started reading it as an unrelated story, and I think that's why we got the ending wrong. We started, like for an Israel, a person, a member of Israel, it was always about what God was doing with you in the earth, in the land. What is God doing here? It was never about leaving here to go be with God. And when we changed the Jewish aspect of the gospel, we lost the right ending. And we forgot that the text actually says, as clear as can be, that there's a new creation. There's a renewal of the whole world, which is this world without the curse. That is the end of this story. So.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So the question is when, it's kind of related to the other question, when did we change this story from not just being with Jesus and resurrection bodies, but actually thinking that the point of salvation is escaping the earth, right? I mean, I've been at funerals where they sing, I'll fly away, right? Which actually quotes lyrics from Plato, right? That's a Platonic Greek pagan thought that the point of salvation is to fly away, that it uses the language of the prison house of the body, That's Platonic language, which is to say that's pagan language. That is not Christian language. The body is not our prison house. It's part of being made in the image of God to be a physical creature in his temple that images God. And our spirits and our bodies were always meant to be together. Death is this horrific separation of our spirit from our body, what God had always intended to be together and to live forever. So this disparagement of the human body, which has been a problem in church history, right? This disparagement that the body is a prison house, it doesn't matter, or that the body is what's evil. Our spirits can be redeemed, but the body is always evil, needs to always be resisted. That whole thing came from paganism, specifically from Platonism, where it actually was a thing in Greek thought that the physical world is overall evil, and what we're striving to do, what we're striving to escape from, is this world and its evil temptations, so we can be spirits again up in the heavens, away from anything physical. That is Greek thought. It is not biblical Jewish Hebrew thought. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you've ever heard the interpretation of Romans 8, especially 18 through 28, which is usually read individualistically as kind of an order of salvation and all, but seems to be really Paul suggesting kind of what you were talking about, just that restoration of humanity conformed to the image of the Son. But I just found this interpretation that suggests that what Paul's saying when the Spirit, when we have groanings and too deep for words and everything, he's connecting that to the groaning of creation, and that humans are supposed to be praying, interceding for creation, and the Holy Spirit helps us do that. I was just wondering if you ever come across that interpretation or had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I just heard about a new book that goes into that in depth, which I haven't read yet. But I didn't mention this, but that gets at a really important point. The role of humans in God's creation temple is meant to be a priestly role. I don't think I said that. But you think about it, the role of a priest is somebody who's part of a bigger group, who's called out for special service on behalf of the rest of the group. So human beings as a whole are called to a priestly role in the creation to represent the whole creation before God, praying, interceding, groaning for the life of the world, not just us and our immediate personal concerns, but we are the priests for the whole world. Part of our founding vocation is to fulfill this priestly role and be those who seek to represent the whole world before God in prayers and intercessions and even in wordless groans because the pain is so great. That's part of what it means to be human, is to think about the life of the whole world. There's an Eastern Orthodox book by Alexander Shaman called For the Life of the World, which gets at this whole aspect beautifully, if you ever want to read that.
I think Glenn has read every book ever published on the planet.
It's not true, but I have one more I would like to quickly mention. If you want a better version of what I was trying to say today, this is the best book I have found on what the story of the Bible is. It's called The Drama of the Bible by Craig Bartholomew and Michael Goheen, and it is simply amazing, eye-opening for what's actually going on in the biblical story as you go through these 6 acts. I touched on a little bit of what they do, but this is the book to get if you really want to get what is the story of the Bible. It's called The Drama of Scripture.